In this video, you are going to master the part 2 of how to play the Trompowsky opening with the white pieces. So let's start. So we are playing with the white pieces and we start the game with 1d4. The opponent plays knight to f6, and here there are two ways white commonly used to play, c4 and bishop to f4. But in today's video, we are going to play the move bishop to g5, which is also known as the Trompowsky opening, and a very interesting opening it is, and not very well known in the club level players. So you can use this particular opening to score some heavy points in your tournament games or even against your friends. And after bishop to g5, black continues with knight to e4. There are three other ways for black to continue the possession: e6, d5 or even c5. But today we are going to focus on the move knight to e4, and here we are going to play the move h4. And after h4, in the previous video, in the part 1, we have discussed the variation c5, which was a bit lengthy. But today we are going to discuss all the other sidelines that are available in this particular position. So after h4, there are three critical moves to continue the possession from the black side. Black can play the move d5, black can play the move c6, or black can even go for capturing the bishop on g5. So first, let's try to discuss what happens if black simply tries to go for capturing the bishop. We capture the knight, and here black plays the move c5. And after c5, we push the pawn to d5, and here black plays the move queen to b6. A very same idea, hitting the pawn on b2. In the previous video, we can simply transpose this position by playing the move knight d2, queen into b2 followed by e3, and the game goes on. But at the place of going for this particular variation and sacrificing a pawn, in this particular position, you can already play the move queen c1, defending this pawn, both the pawns, and now you are having a happy position. White is already better. Why? Because it looks like white is having double pawns on the g file, indeed. But at the same time, white is also having the open h file, which gives white a huge amount of counterplay. And because of the g5 pawn, white is having more space on the king side, which gives already a big advantage to white in this particular position. So that's how you can simply continue this position if your opponent simply goes for capturing the bishop. Now, if your opponent goes for playing the move c6. So after c6, we are going to play the move knight to d2. And after knight d2, there is only a single move that justifies this particular c6 move. Black must play the move queen f5. And after queen f5, it only benefits us because black is just wasting the moves by developing the queen so early out of the opening. We can just focus on developing our pieces with knight g to f3. Black plays g5, and here we play the move c3, removing this pin. And now our idea is to simply capture the knight on e4. So black plays the move bishop to f5, and here we simply capture the knight. Black is forced to capture with the bishop because if you try to capture with the pawn, the bishop is bad. Black is having two pawns on the e file, which is simply a bad idea. So bishop takes, and now we play the move knight to d2, attacking the bishop. Bishop falls back to f5, and black is thinking that black is pretty happy in this position. And there are no pretty good reasons for black to be not good because black is having the bishop pin. But here we are already going to surprise our opponent by playing the move e4 in this position, breaking in the center. And here black is forced to capture with the pawn because if you try to capture with the bishop, I can already capture the bishop, takes bishop c4. We are having the bishop pair, we can already capture the e4 pawn in the future, and we are already better. So pawn takes the only option, and now we can simply play the move bishop c4. Now what's the idea? After bishop c4, our idea is to simply play the move g4, queen e2, and get the pawn back. How? For example, at h6, bishop f4, e6, trying to develop the bishop from f8 square. We play the move g4, kicking the bishop back, and now simply queen e2, attacking the pawn on e4, and now we simply chop off the pawn on e4, having more space on the king side, and white is already better in this position. So that's exactly how you can play if your opponent plays the move c6. Now coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays the move d5? After d5, we continue with knight d2. And after knight d2, there are already three critical moves for black to continue the position. Black can either go for capturing the knight, capture the bishop, or black can even go for playing the move bishop to f5. First, let's try to discuss what happens if black simply focus on developing his pieces with bishop to f5. After bishop f5, we can already chop the knight. Bishop takes, kind of the fourth move, and we already play the move f3, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes to f5, and there is another move which is h6. So if black tries to play bishop f5, first going back with the bishop, we can play the move g4, kicking the bishop back, and now playing the move queen to d2. Not playing the move something like e3, bishop d3, because we are keeping flexibility with the pawn on e2. We can directly push the pawn to e4 in the future. That's why we are first developing our queen. The idea is to simply do a long castle. Black plays h6, because it is kind of a natural and necessary move to make, because if you try to open up the king side, you have to play h6 to remove the bishop. So bishop f4 and now c5. And after c5, we can already strike in the center with e4, developing the piece, takes, and already d5. And it looks like we have sacrificed a pawn that we have in d. And after g5, like white is already having more space because of the powerful d5 pawn, limiting the knight on b8. And if you try to capture the pawn, I can simply capture it back. And after bishop takes, black is 2 pawns up, but after knight e5, white is already having a very interesting position and a completely winning position, because black pieces have not developed yet, whereas white is fully prepared to do a long castle, rook e1, and just destroy black's king. So that's exactly how you can develop your pieces if your opponent plays bishop to f5. If your opponent plays the move h6, you can simply fall back with the bishop to h7, and now you can play the move e3 in this position. A very interesting one. e6 and now bishop d3. Trading off the bishop, and after c5, you can play the move knight to e2. Simply focus on developing the pieces. And after knight c6, now you can play the move queen b3. The idea is to put pressure on the b7 pawn, and after queen d7, you can now chop the pawn on c5, followed by long castling. And the idea is pretty simple. You can simply open up this position with e4, because the queen is on the same file as the rook, and white is already having a very interesting position. If black tries to do a short castle, it only benefits white, because we are fully prepared to play the move g4, h5, g5, and just blast off the king side. That's how you can continue the position if your opponent plays bishop to f5. If your opponent plays the move knight into d2, capturing the knight, we simply capture the knight back, and here black is already having 3 critical moves to continue the position. Black can play the move knight to c6, black can play the move c5, or black can even go for playing the move bishop to f5. If black focuses on developing the pieces with bishop f5, we first play long castle, and after long castle, black plays h6, because black has to play h6. Because if black wants to develop his king side, he has to play h6, kick the bishop, and then he has to play the move e6. So h6, bishop f4, and now e6. And after e6, we can already play the move f3. Our idea is pretty simple. We want to play the move g4 in this position, grabbing more space on the king side. So after h5, trying to stop g4 idea, which is very natural move, now we can already play a very strong move, e4 in this position, opening in the center, sacrificing a pawn, and now simply playing the move queen e3, attacking the bishop f5. You cannot play the move bishop d5, putting more pressure on the a2 pawn because of c4. And after bishop falls back, already d5, and white is completely winning in this position. So going back, that's why bishop f5. And after bishop f5, you can still play the move d5. Our idea is to simply capture the pawn, attacking the queen, and also simply blast off the king. So black has to play the move knight d7. We simply play the move first, knight to f3, developing the piece. And after bishop to c5, attacking the queen, we can play the move queen c3, attacking the g7 pawn, allowing black to do a short castle, and now simply chop off the pawn on e6. And after bishop takes, you can already play the move rook into knight, and after queen d7, simply chop off the bishop. We are having 2 minor pieces for a rook, and the position is already winning for white. So that's how you can easily continue this position if your opponent plays bishop to f5. Now discussing what happens if your opponent plays c5. After c5, you can play the move e4 in this position, a very interesting one, allowing your opponent to capture the pawn on e4, and now pushing the pawn to g5. The idea remains the same. You want to limit the knight on b8, and after g5, black plays h6. We simply pull back the bishop to e3, attacking the pawn on c5. Black plays e5. So black's idea here is, if we try to do an passant, black will simply trade off the queen and capture the pawn with the bishop, and black is having a better position. But in this position, we can already play the move, a very strong one, f3. Now what's the idea? After f3, it's kind of forced to capture the pawn. And after takes, we are not going to capture the pawn with the knight, but instead we are going to capture the pawn with the pawn. Because if we try to capture the pawn with the knight, here black can already play the move bishop d6, long castle, and e4, and black is already having a better position. So that's the reason, at the place of capturing with the knight, we capture with the pawn, and after bishop d6, we play the move knight to e2. And now what's the idea of white? So white wants to play the move long castle, long castle, knight c3, knight to e2, knight to e4, bishop to e2, push the pawn to h5, bring all his army to the king side, and just destroy the king side, and you are already winning the position. So that's how you can continue the position if your opponent plays the move c5. If your opponent plays the move knight to c6, which looks like a bit artificial because generally the knight does not come to c6 because it just ruins up the pawn structure. So after knight c6, we play the move simply e3. f6, we play the move bishop f4, e5, trying to grab the center. That's the idea of knight c6. Simply you can capture the pawn, bishop g3, and white is already having no issues because white's idea is to play the move bishop b5, pinning up the knight, followed by long castle, knight f3, and putting maximum pressure on the center pawn, which can become a target in the future, and white is already having a better position. So that's how you can continue the position if your opponent plays knight into d2. If your opponent goes for playing the move knight into g5, the final move, after knight g5, we can simply capture the knight in this position, and here black is having 4 critical moves to continue the position. Black can play the move g6, bishop to f5, e5, or even black can play the move c5. So if your opponent starts with what happens if c5. After c5, you can already chop the pawn on c5 because it is not a good move. So after d into c5, black is having 2 moves. Black can play the move e6 or even e5. If black starts with e5, after e5, we can play the move e4, opening up the center and trying to develop the pieces as fast as possible. So after e4, black is again having 2 moves. Black can either push the pawn or try to capture the pawn. So if black captures the pawn, we can simply capture the pawn back, queen takes, and now play the move knight to f3. Now why knight f3? We want to play the move bishop to c4, but we can't because the g2 pawn is hanging. So first we are developing the knight, and after black plays something like knight c6, we can play the move bishop c4, queen d6, and already queen to e2. The idea is pretty the same. We want to do a long castle and move the knight. So bishop f5, long castle, and knight to e4. The queen falls back. We simply capture the bishop and capture the pawn on f7. We are a pawn up and having a no problems. So going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight c6. If your opponent goes for doing a short castle, after short castle, you can play the move bishop d3 because the rook is extremely strong on h1, eyeing on h7. So black is forced to play g6 and now already bishop c4, attacking the queen. And now what's the idea? White is going to play queen e2, long castle, and just get the army on the king side and just checkmate the black king. So that's how you can play if your opponent plays bishop into c5. If your opponent plays t4 in this position, pushing the pawn, you can now play the move knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5. Black defends it with knight c6, and now you play the move bishop b5, pinning up the knight, and now the same idea of capturing the pawn on e5. So now black must play the move bishop to g4, pinning up the knight as well. And now we are going to play the move simply b4, protecting the pawn on c5. And now white is already having a pretty better position because if black even tries to play something like a5, trying to put pressure, you can play the move either knight c4, attacking the pawn, or you can even play the move a3, defending the pawn, and white is already having a better position. So that's how you can continue the position if your opponent plays e5. If your opponent goes for playing the move e6, so after e6, you can play the move c4 in this position now, opening up in the center, but with the move c4, not e4. So after c4, if black captures the pawn, we can simply develop our knight, queen f6, and now first play the move rook c1, developing the piece. If your opponent plays knight c6, simply capture the pawn, pawn takes, and now you can play the move b4, a very strong move. After b4, allowing your opponent to capture the b4 pawn, and now simply playing the move e4, opening up the position because we want to have this material advantage, the activity advantage. So after e4, if black tries to capture the pawn, it's already losing because white is just having too much activity. So black must push the pawn, and now we simply push the pawn to e5, queen f5, and already queen b3, kicking the knight, and already bishop d3. White is just having too much ahead in development. White is completely winning. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight c6. If your opponent plays dc4, you can play the move knight c4, and here bishop c5, you can play the move knight d6 check, and white is already completely winning in this position. You move the king, I capture the bishop, and if you capture the knight, I first capture the bishop, followed by capturing the bishop. So going back, bishop c5 is a blunder. If knight c6, you can first play the move a3, a very interesting one, allowing bishop c5, b4, kicking the bishop back, b5, and now simply putting the knight to e5, having too much space in the center, and I don't see any way for black to continue the position, and white is already better. So that's how you can continue if your opponent captures the pawn on c4. If your opponent plays the move bishop into c5, you can now first capture on d5, attacking the bishop. So knight d7. Now you can even capture the pawn on e6, and white is already having a better position. So you can easily continue this position if your opponent plays c5. If your opponent plays e5 in this position, which is the best move according to the engine. After e5, you can simply play the move ge5, queen g5, and you can play the move knight f3, attacking the queen, taking the queen back, and now you can play the move e3. Now what's the idea? After e3, knight c6, you put your knight to b3, you play the queen to d2 and do a long castle, and after bishop e7, you can simply finally develop your bishop to d3. And now there are two moves for black. Black can either play the move bishop f5 or even go for capturing the pawn. If bishop f5, you can just trade off the bishop, put your knight to d4, put your knight f to d4 in this position. A very important thing to notice, because if you put your b knight after takes, c5 is a very strong move from the black side. So that is the reason. Put your f knight and after takes. Now king to b8, because the a7 is already hanging. So king b8 and after queen f4. White is having a very interesting endgame after queen trade, and white is already better in this position. So you can easily continue this position if your opponent plays bishop f5. If your opponent goes for capturing the pawn on g2, you can now play the move knight d4. We have a knight trade at c5 and already rook g1, and the queen is already trapped on g2. So that's how you can continue the position if your opponent goes for playing the move e5. If your opponent goes for playing the move g6 in this position, now we try to change our setup. We play the move e3, putting our pawns on the dark squares, c5, and you can simply play the move c3. And white is already having no issues in this position. We can play the move knight f3, bishop e2, king f2, rook h1, just playing on the king side if ever black decides to do a short castle. So a very interesting one. White is already better. So that's exactly what happens if g6. If bishop f5, after bishop f5, you can already play the move e3, e6, and now you can play the move c4. Playing like a London system, I would say. After c4, c6, and now simply g4. Why g4? You want to play the move queen to b3 in this position, but before playing queen b3, let's try to grab more space on the king side by playing g4, kicking the bishop back, and now queen b3. So after queen b3, queen b6, you can play the move c5, and if queen to c7, going back with the queen, you can already play the move f4, grabbing more space, and after b6, because white side is pretty simple, knight f3, knight e5, and like you can even play bishop e2, bishop d3, and white is already better. So black has to open up the position via b6. You can take, and rook c1. c6 is weak, and if black tries to capture the queen, white is the one only better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen c1, queen c7. If your opponent trades off the queen, you can simply capture the queen with the pawn this time, because the idea is pretty simple. You want to play f4 now, followed by b4, b5, typical against anti-London, and you can have a very commanding position and a completely winning position. So this is how you can continue and play the move Trompowsky Opening, a very interesting one. So you have successfully mastered the Trompowsky Opening knight to e4 variation. So if you learned anything new today, make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and I'm going to see you soon. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching OneShot Chess.